Hello, good morning. This is Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Ansari, Department of Political Science, Aligarh Muslim University. Today I will be making my presentation on presidential system, and today I will talk about the merits and demerits of this system. Now, the chief merit of the presidential system is that without being responsible, it retains a representative character. The president is an elected representative of the people, but his tenure does not depend upon the fluctuating wills of the legislature. A fixed tenure of office accounts for the greater continuity of policy and firmness in administration, and it can be successfully carried out without any fear or break. The principal virtue of the presidential system is the fact that it creates a stable executive within the framework of a democratic order. This means promptness, vigor, and initiative in administration. All executive authority is vested at one center, and the head of the state is executive and also the executive. He is, in a word, is a general of the administration, and as such there can be no question of divided policy. His ministers or secretaries follow the policy initiated by him. The president is not only the head of the state but also the head of the government, and the president directs the executive branch of the federal government and is responsible for implementing and enforcing laws which are created by Congress. So the president appoints the heads of the federal agencies, including the cabinet, and plays a leading role in federal legislation and domestic policy making. Second merit of this system is unity of command. So unity of control and quickness in decision and concerted policy, which emergency of any kind may demand, can best be obtained in the presidential system. In the presidential system, unity of command, quickness in decision making, and concerted policy are essential during emergency. The president has the power to make extraordinary measures, and he can take extraordinary measures such as declaring martial law or seizing control of the internet to address the crisis. While these powers may seem alarming, they are meant to ensure the safety and security of the nation. However, it's important to remember that president's powers are limited by the Constitution, Congress, and the court. These checks and balances are in place to prevent any abuse of power and to uphold the principles of democracy. The head of the state is the chief foreign policy maker and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the country. As commander-in-chief, he may even take, in case of war, the command of the military operations and effectively control matters of vital importance in domestic and foreign affairs, just as Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt did in the United States in 2 world wars. What President Roosevelt did during the economic crisis of the 30s of the previous century, George Bush in Gulf War in 1991 are matters of contemporary history. All this is not problem, and all this is not possible in the cabinet system of government. Now, during emergency, this system becomes very effective. Now, one example of president who held this important role was John F. Kennedy. He served as the 35th president of the United States from 1961 to 1963. Now, Kennedy's presidency was marked by the Cold War, and his efforts to navigate relations with the Soviet Union and Cuba are especially remarkable. He was also known for his strong leadership during times of crisis such as the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the role of president goes beyond just being a political figure, and the president is responsible for the well-being of the entire nation and its citizens. So, the president must make decisions that affect the economy, national security, and the daily lives of Americans. It is important for the president to act with honesty and probity and to conduct the business of the country in a way that benefits all citizens. Even Winston Churchill, who attained new heights of power and authority, had not the personal power of the President of the United States. To illustrate the difference in the position and powers in the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Britain, Jennings writes that the President pledged the United States to the realization of objectives of Atlantic Charter, while the War Cabinet, not the Prime Minister, pledged the United Kingdom. So the president is also head of the nation and is not merely a party leader. This gives him greater dignity, prestige and authority. The nation looks to him to steer the country through any kind of national emergency. Then in this system, another merit is here not the amateurs but experts are appointed. And this presidential system makes possible the appointment of experts to head the various departments of the government without consideration of their party affiliation. President Cleveland, a Democrat, appointed Walter Grisham as Secretary of State, and he had been thought of as a Republican candidate for the presidency. Then Roosevelt and Taft each appointed a Democratic Secretary of War, and Hoover made a Democratic Attorney General. Roosevelt's choice of Henry Stimson as Secretary of War and of Franklin as Secretary of Navy in 1940, both prominent Republicans, are two more notable examples. Prime Minister is in a parliamentary system cannot normally do this. If the cabinet is to work as a team, it must consist of persons who think alike and belong to the same party to act alike. Again, though a Prime Minister has a choice in selecting his colleagues, yet his party expects certain men to be in the cabinet and the country too expects them to be there. Then the allotment of various departments to ministers is a matter of political consideration and expediency rather than of aptitude for the work they are expected to perform. There is no political expediency which may weigh with the president, and there is no party crisis which he may have to be afraid of. Then another merit of this system is efficient administration. Now the president's secretaries or cabinet ministers, they have no berth in the legislature, and the congressional load of work with them is negligible, nor have they any constituency to nurse or to look forward to the days of election. So they have thus the time and energy to devote themselves exclusively to administrative work and pursue the policies of the government, unaffected by political exigencies. There is another advantage too. Now, since the executive is not responsible to the legislature and his adverse vote does not bring about a crisis in the government, the tumult of the party spirit is less in evidence. It is also claimed that due to the presence of the system of checks and balances, there prevails a great sense of stability and administrative machinery works more efficiently and effectively. Now, administrative machinery works more efficiently and effectively in the presidential system as it recognizes the need of the organization and improves efforts that can bring about modernization and streamline the administrative management of the government. By implementing the recommendations of the Committee on Administrative Management, the government can become more efficient and effective in serving the needs of the people. It's crucial to continue striving for better management in order to ensure the success and survival of democracy. Then stability and order is another merit of the system. Now, the advocates of presidential form argue that such a system is best suited for countries inhabited by different communities with diverse interests. Homogeneous dual policy system, which is so essential for the success of cabinet government, cannot be secured under these conditions. Multiple party system is a general outcome when the people are divided both horizontally and vertically. But a government formed out of heterogeneous element is a weak and unstable government. So under the presidential system, there is a solidarity, that is the executive. The president is the unmistakable focus of responsibility. Government, either for its creation or for existence, does not depend on the complexion of legislature. In the United States, however, two-party system is firmly rooted. In the presidential system, it also allows for the independence of state governments, creating a federation where state governments have their own power and are not under the control of the central government. This ensures that the interests of different regions and communities are represented. In countries like the United States, which follows the presidential system, the federal and state courts, along with the legislature, they act as a check on the executive branch. Now, this prevents any one person or party from gaining too much control, thereby ensuring the stability and order in the system. Now, talking about the drawbacks, we find the critics of presidential system, who are numerous, they argue that it divides government into watertight compartments as it is based on separation of powers. In actual practice, there can be no rigid division between the executive and legislative departments, and to divide them into independent and coordinate departments is to create friction between them, which is highly injurious to the good and efficient government. So much time is consumed in struggles among the various branches of government to undermine and to determine the extent of their respective powers. Also, the very stability of the system verges on inflexibility. Now, while there is debate about the effectiveness of the traditional separation of power in the modern world, reforms can be implemented to maintain benefits of the separation of power while also allowing the efficient government. Now, these reforms would ensure that agencies are checked and prevented abuses of power while still allowing for the expertise and low-cost decision-making of administrative agencies. Now, by striking this balance, the government can uphold the principles of limited government and separation of power while effectively addressing the needs of a modern society. Now, another drawback is that of a conflict. By establishing the presidential system, Farner says the father of the American Constitution separated the executive source of the government, the executive source of the knowledge, from the legislative center of their application. Now, it severed their connection between those who ask for supplies and those who have the power to grant them. So, they introduced the continuous possibility of a conflict between two legislative branches, each created in each the necessity for separate leadership in their separate business, and made this leadership independent of existence and functions of the executive. So, the framers of the US Constitution structured the government with separate powers for each branch, ensuring that no one branch becomes too powerful and that the people's will is represented. Congress, as the legislative branch, has the power to pass law, declare war, ratify treaties and levy taxes, and the executive branch, headed by a president, conducts the foreign affairs and commands the armed forces. So, judicial branch interprets the law and determines their constitutionality. Now, this division of powers requires cooperation and competition among the branches to accomplish policy making goals, which leads invariably to a conflict. Then another allegation on this system is that of a delay. When powers are divided, it is claimed, between the executive and legislative branches without any means for proper coordination, there is always inordinate delay to arrive at an agreement even on pressing proposal. One branch of government may be operating on one policy, whereas the other may be following quite a different one, particularly when executive belongs to one party and the legislative majority is that of another party. Now, this condition may produce a stalemate in the time of crisis, as during 1931 and 32 of worldwide depression, which can be disastrous. Now, during George W. Bush administration, there was an effort to expand the president's power in relation to the other branches of government. They wanted to strengthen the president's ability to withhold the document from Congress and the courts using executive privilege. Now, this doctrine had been weakened during the Clinton administration, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of President Bush later on, stating that he didn't even have to assert executive privilege to protect certain documents from disclosure. However, after 2006 elections, when the Democrats regained control of the House of Representatives, there was more oversight of this executive branch. Now, directionless legislation is another allegation or another demerit of this system, that is called presidential system. Now, lack of direct initiative in legislation on the part of the executive is really a very serious defect in the presidential system. Legislation is the main function of the executive, and here the legislator does not act under its instruction. So, there are accordingly be no cohesiveness and the party ties which bind the executive and the legislature. They are too flimsy for an integrated policy. The result is that the legislative procedure is different essentially from one in a country having the parliamentary system, where the financial procedure is worlds apart and there is no coordination of political energy or responsibility. The lack of direct initiative in legislation in the presidential system can have negative consequences. It can create a policy gridlock where important legislation is stalled or blocked. It can also result in a lack of responsiveness to the needs and preferences of majority of citizens. In addition, it can hinder the ability of the executive to effectively address pressing issues and implement their agenda. Therefore, it is important to carefully consider the merits and drawbacks of different systems of government when designing constitutional mechanism. So, a separate authority, each branch has its own derivation of authority and its morsel of responsibility in presidential system. And in order to remove the possibilities of concentration of authority at one single end, a system of checks and balances may have to be introduced as in American Constitution. Now, the system of checks and balances is not only the negation of the theory of separation of powers, but it is also highly injurious to administrative efficiency. Now, somewhat ironically, Professor Beard remarks that the checks and balances in United States designate and it was designed to promote overall equilibrium, often operates rather to aggravate than to ameliorate the ill effects of separation, as for example, in the case of presidential veto and senatorial assent to treaties. If the system of checks and balances has prevented the likelihood of authoritarian government, it has also led to at times the weakening of effective government. So, the system of checks and balances can sometimes lead to challenges and disagreements. One example is the process of impeachment, which is a check on the executive branch. Now, impeachment is the process by which the president can be removed from the office for high crimes and misdemeanors. It involves the House of Representatives bringing charges against the president, followed by a trial in the Senate. While impeachment is intended to hold the president accountable for any wrongdoing, it can also be a contentious and divisive process. Overall, the system of checks and balances in the United States is designed to promote a fair and balanced government, while it can sometimes lead to challenges and disagreements as well. Then another drawback of presidential form is its autocratic and irresponsible president who sometimes can become. Now, once the president has been elected, the nation must continue with him. Now, that's a compulsion, whether they like it or approve of his policies or not. He may become autocratic, even degenerate into a dictator, subject to the provisions of the Constitution. Now, the legislature has no constitutional power to withdraw the mandate which the electorate gave him at the time of election. Now, this has been well explained by Bigot when he says, "You have bespoken your government in advance, and whether it suits you or not, whether it works well or ill, whether it is what you want or not, by law you must keep it." Now, this charge on presidential system is one-sided and partisan, as Congress can initiate impeachment proceedings against the president to check his irresponsible action. Further, judiciary can withhold his actions under its power of judicial review and call it in contravention of Constitution and thus null and void. Now, constitutional rigidity is another allegation on this presidential form, because the constitutional provisions need always to be adhered to in time of peace or war. During Second World War, presidential elections in America were held twice, whereas the general elections was postponed in United Kingdom by an act of parliament. In America, there could not be any postponement without amending the Constitution itself, which is a difficult and a lengthy process. Now, the rigidity of the Constitution does not take cognizance of the needs of the hour. It must take its own course, though it may at times prove harmful to the interest of the nation. Now, one of the main reasons why the American Constitution is so difficult to amend is because of the supermajority approvals required for any change. This creates a complex process that is hard to navigate. Additionally, The current dynamics of the constitutional politics in the United States has made it even more challenging to coordinate between the national and the state governments, as well as between the two major political parties. Now, these factors have essentially frozen the constitution, making it virtually impossible for any proposed amendments to be ratified. Now, some experts argue that the amending clause, which describes and regulates the amending power, is the most important part of the constitution, and they believe that the rules for changing the constitution are crucial for the development and continuity of the state. For a normative and from a normative perspective, amendment rules are seen as a way to delegate the constitutional power and affirm the democratic values of self-government. From a positive perspective, the Constitution serves as a self-enforcing contract and contradiction mechanisms in a democratic country. Amendments rules allow the Constitution to evolve and adapt to necessary changes. However, the level of rigidity in a Constitution determines how difficult it is to make these changes. Now, lack of harmony is another charge, and finally, the presidential system has frequently been criticized for being unequal to the task of conducting a vigorous foreign policy. It is asserted the president's dependence on cooperation of a frequently recalcitrant Congress makes United States foreign policy a slow-moving and uncertain affair. No one, including friends and foes, can guess about the degree to which executive actions and commitments will be sustained or repudiated by Congress. So, absence of dissolution in the presidential system is responsible for such less harmony and more tension than in the parliamentary system. The executive has no means to bring to book a refractory legislature. So, the president must navigate the influence of Congress, law passed by Congress, treaties approved by the Senate, nominations made by the president can all influence the US interactions with other countries. Congress has historically used its oversight role to show disapproval of executive action or change policy. This includes high-profile investigations into events such as the Iran-Contra affair and the intelligence problem leading up to the September 11, 2001 attacks. So, the geopolitics of oil is an example of how the president's foreign policy can be affected by Congress. Russia's invasion of Ukraine upended the geopolitics of oil, as Russia is one of the top 3 oil producers in the world. This event caused a reshaping and remapping of oil geopolitics, leading to shift in how countries think about oil security. The president's ability to respond to such events and shape foreign policy is dependent on the cooperation of the Congress, which can influence US interaction with other countries, though the law is passed. Now, in conclusion, what we find, the Bryce maintained that the parliamentary system has many advantages for countries of moderate size. The presidential, constructed for safety rather than for promptitude in action and not staking large issues on sudden decisions, is to be preferred for states of vast area and population such as the United States and Germany. In the United States of America, the presidential system has worked vigorously well wherever basic units are required in an exceptional crisis. Statesmanship and patriotism has always provided it by effective appeal to the voters through the spoken words, press, radio, and lately television, social media. The president have succeeded in dramatizing their programs and compelling considerations of their views by a system of government which cannot be generally and easily applied to ordinary conditions, fails to command universal respect. So, the success of the ratio of presidential system across the world varies. The effectiveness of a presidential system depends on how executive and legislative branches interact and cooperate. In some cases, a presidential system can lead to policy gridlock or authoritarian tendencies. So, it is important to design the system of government mechanism in a way that counters political fragmentation and ensures intra-branch cooperation. So, Americas and Americans generally agree on domestic ideals and values that are important for the United States, but they see the country falling short in living up to these ideals. The public's criticism of political system include a failure of a failure to hold political system accountable. Now, the lack of transparency in the government is one of the reasons. So, despite these criticisms, most Americans say that democracy is working well in the United States, but there is broad support for making significant changes to the political system. Now, with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you.